Welcome to the Unwashed Asses, episode 123, recorded for Friday, August 30th, 2019. It's finally done. I can finally set it down, close the cover on it, and just let it sit as I marinate in the delicious stew that was Marvel's Spider-Man. Spider-Man stew, on the outset, doesn't sound appealing or appetizing, yet is a dish I feel everybody should try, and I'm going to stop with the culinary allegory here. Finally wrapped up Spider-Man on PS4, which was released tail end of last year, in 2018. Been putting it off and finally got around to it, and a few episodes ago I did a preview. But now that I've wrapped up not only the main game, but all of the DLC, I felt now's the time that I can, give an informed opinion, a review, a critique of sorts. This is just going to cover the base game, though. DLC I'm going to have to do in a separate episode because my feelings on the two were very diverse and conflicted. So I feel rather than to do like one big overall lump sum impression, we'll break it up here. So, with the main game itself, I guess first let's get into graphics and how pretty it is. The city of New York is just beautifully realized and rendered in loving detail with windows showing reflections of nearby buildings, which I guess was pre-generated. If you get close enough, you can see inside of some windows, which if you look too closely, you'll see it's kind of a same repeating pattern. Rooms have 3 doors that lead into identical rooms with another 3 doors, and it doesn't always make sense, but when you're zipping by on your web, you're not looking at all those fine details that make up the city, but together they're the individual pieces of a larger puzzle that paints this gorgeous picture of New York and Spider-Man's world itself. Characters themselves are rendered in excruciating detail to the point where my 5-year-old was like, wow, that looks very, very real. And when I compare it to things like Roblox, yes, it's going to. You get a bit of uncanny valley as you look at characters, say like Mary Jane or Aunt May, but overall it's fairly believable until you start getting into some of the costumes that are based more on the cartoons, like the manga Spider-Man or the Into the Spider-Verse Spider-Man, which stand out in contrast but provide a sense of comedic joy or just overall appreciation of the artistry on full display here, particularly when you get into the animated Spider-Man suit where the shading on it changes in real time and it all looks like beautifully hand-drawn character art. It works, and it doesn't come across looking like rotoscoping or anything of the ilk. And things like the crispness of the trees, and because we're in full-on October where the game takes place, the way the city transitions from day into gorgeous golden sunset into the darkness of a city that truly doesn't sleep as the lights are dazzling to swing through, and it's all just a lot going on here, and it works to extreme lengths. When I compare it to, I guess the only real counterpart I can think of would be the Arkham games or the Batman series, where eventually you start off in Arkham Asylum, you branch off into a larger Arkham City, which is a few city blocks that now make up the prison, before you get into Gotham proper. And despite being a game of this current generation, I almost feel like there's a lot more going on with Spider-Man in comparison to Batman. Batman, while it was a fully fleshed out world, it felt more like, okay, here's 3 or 4 islands to play around on, and it's just full of bad guys. You don't have a living, breathing city like you do in Spider-Man, where you can walk around and there are hundreds of NPCs walking about that will interact with you, and it's not like they have just terrible graphics or renderings themselves. Even things like squirrels and pigeons have a decent amount of, polygon count to them, and a few texture packs that really just everything works extremely well. And there's nothing quite like climbing to the top of a building and panning around the city before diving off and entering a free fall before throwing out your web line and catching yourself before zipping off. It's just astonishing. Which then ties into how the game itself is presented in terms of sound quality, where you primarily have one track that plays as you swing throughout the city, and it's kind of what I call the hero's theme, and it's reminiscent of the main hero theme from Sam Raimi's Spider-Man movies, the ones with Tobey Maguire, where you have a very clear but not overbearing horn section trumpeting and heralding the hero as he swings through the city. But there's also striking violin that come in and almost like a boat on a river carry the musical piece throughout, where it then gets punctuated by the horns. But I'm not a musician. I can't really get into depth beyond that. Just decided to say, despite hearing the one piece over and over again, it never really gets old. It never failed to inspire me as I was playing the game. When I think of music in games or movies, the one that strikes me in this instance is how you have the Avengers theme that would play throughout the Avengers movies or some of the solo adventures, where by the end of Endgame or even into Infinity War, I was sick of the theme itself. I felt it was overused, even when they would try to change up the piece. It no longer failed to inspire me, and it just served to pull me out of the movie because I was now getting annoyed and agitated with it. But not so the case with Spider-Man. And even when you get into the practical sound effects of, Spider-Man punching or even the thwip of the web, it all sounds right. It sounds in place. Like you read the Spider-Man comics, and I know we've had plenty of Spider-Man movies and games leading up to this point, but everything was done with such care that you never get snapped out of it and never think, oh, that sounds weird, or that's not how I would have imagined that sounding. Even things like shooting the web shooters. As you swing through the city, you kind of tune it out, but every now and then, like especially when you're trying to focus on swinging or going through difficult challenges, you have the action punctuated by the webs being shot and attaching to the building, and it accents the action in a way that I wasn't expecting, especially when you get into stealth sections where it's the same sound effect being played, but it's almost like the web shooters are whispering as you're webbing up bad guys and, trying to stay quiet and attaching them to, flagpoles and stuff and getting them out of the way. Even things like the gadgets or the web bombs, where there would be an explosion of web and it'd wrap up a bunch of guys, or you hear NPCs talking, and the voice acting itself, it's all just done extremely well. And that's another thing I want to point out, is the voice acting is phenomenal. The actor, really, I can't think of a bad one in the entire game. Everyone sounds right at home. It doesn't feel phoned in. They're believable voices. You know how sometimes you get like the Christian Bale of movies where he's doing a Batman and it just sounds so out of place and wrong, and it pulls you out. And in some instances, like say Andrew Garfield's American accent in the Amazing Spider-Man movies, it doesn't sit quite right when he's playing Peter Parker, but in this instance everything's working as intended. It's believable, especially when a lot of the story is being played out via phone calls as you zip through the city, either Spider-Man calling people or they calling him. A lot of it's coming down to the competency of the voice actors, and it's pulled off with such great flourish. There wasn't a part during the main game where I was tempted to skip any of the dialogue. I was enthralled with it, each and every conversation, to the point where I knew if I was coming up on a checkpoint, I would stop a block away, perch on a rooftop, and let whatever current voice clip, be it a phone call or a J. Jonah Jameson podcast, I would just let it finish and then move into the next section because I didn't want to miss anything. Not just for sake of story, but also the voice acting. I was having a good time with the story being presented to me in this fashion. And that's going to lead into how does the game actually play, and the bulk of it is going to come down to a few formulaic things where you are swinging through the city, you're getting into fights, or you're solving puzzles, most usually involving your gadgets. But I think the thing that most people are going to come to realize, and what they're looking for a lot of times, and if it's not done well, is going to stick out the most to them, is the web swinging. In every Spider-Man game except for like the second one, during the Raimi series, webbing just kind of shot up and attached wherever. You didn't have to be necessarily near anything, but that was based more on physics engines and the limitations at the time. But Spider-Man 2 brought in this sense of, no, you actually have to attach your webbing to nearby buildings, and that will affect your swing angle and how you maneuver through the city. And everyone raved about it. Now, I had not played the game, and so all I could do was kind of just imagine how it worked out. The last real Spider-Man game I had played was a demo for a Spider-Man title back on the PlayStation 1, where everybody had 3 polygons and they had to share them, and it looked terrible, and it's just this big skybox with a couple of rectangular buildings that you're perched on the top of, nothing near what we're experiencing nowadays. And it's that movement, it's that fluidity, it's the acrobatics and the gymnastics that Spider-Man puts on display where, eventually you're going to start figuring out the animations and what everything's going to look like, but much like the sound, you'll see it time and time again, but it never really gets old. To the point where, I spent the bulk of the main game not using fast travel. Fast travel unlocks about halfway into the game, but up until that point, I was obsessed with doing every secondary objective in the game, and to get to a lot of it, or actually all of it, until fast travel is unlocked, you have to web swing throughout the entire city. And so I became quite adept at maneuvering between buildings and dropping quickly and changing on a dime, or swinging through the struts of a water tower, or systematically alternating my webs and working up my way of a fire escape. And it all handles extremely well. And that moves into the combat too, where it's an attack and counterattack system, much like Prince of Persia or the Batman Arkham games, or even Assassin's Creed. But because of who Spider-Man is, he has a lot more at his disposal, where he'll flip over enemies and he'll web them up and slide in between their legs, and it's more of a dance than anything else. And especially when you get into some of the strongholds, or later into the game where enemies have different types of weapons or armor, and you really have to work between all of them, or even do aerial battles. If that control wasn't so tight and polished, it would utterly ruin this game. And there were only a few instances where I would start to run into issues with the controls, and I don't necessarily think it was an issue with the controls, more so my inability to finely tune myself. And usually it'd be like, if I got stuck onto a side of a building, I couldn't detach myself quickly enough to get after an objective, or as quickly as I would have liked, where it broke that fluidity. And again, it's not something I'm going to blame on the game, because the tools were there, and I just kind of never needed to use them, because 98% of the time the controls worked flawlessly and would compensate for my blunders. But when I would break the game enough, it'd be like, no, we're done here. And I guess the game itself, despite graphics and audio and the music and how it plays, it wouldn't be worth playing if there wasn't a solid story backing it. And that's something we definitely get here, where much like Marvel's hand at Spider-Man with Homecoming, they acknowledge that we've had the Uncle Ben story innumerable times. We know who Spider-Man is. We know why he is the way he is and what makes him tick. And so we immediately jump into a Spider-Man living in a small, crappy one-room apartment with a cracked laptop screen and a late rent notice being slipped through the doors. He just instead gets a call that they're taking down the Kingpin, jumps out of the window, and then it's in your hands to go from there. And what we see is a story of Spider-Man. He's 23 at the time. 8 years into the making. He's been doing this for a while, where he's established a rogues gallery. The city knows who he is. He's had contacts. He's already been in a relationship with Mary Jane that's gone south, and he's trying to mend it. We have an Aunt May who he no longer lives with, but still worries about him and works with him at the local homeless shelter. And we start to see the beginnings of potential future rivalries and how Spider-Man has trouble balancing essentially his hero life, his real life, with his real life of being an employee with his mentor, Dr. Octavius, and working at the Feast Center with Aunt May and for Martin Lee, and then taking on the responsibility of mentoring other people like Miles Morales. And it all works in a very believable fashion. A lot of it is broken down into different areas where, kind of getting back into how the game plays, aside from the main story missions, you have secondary objectives, and these can be things like taking down enemy strongholds, to things like solving Taskmaster's puzzles, defusing bombs, helping a homeless man catch pigeons, tracking down Spider-Man's lost backpacks. And all of this I've done so long ago, because that's one thing this game doesn't skimp on, is the amount of content there. And it's almost overwhelming in a sense of how much there is to do, especially if you're someone like me who strives to 100% complete a game. That you have to get absolutely everything. And there's a handy tracker in there like, you're X% done, where I was doing everything in my power to avoid completing any of the main story until I completed all the secondary stuff. And it was dragging on and on and on. And this was a mistake I had made with the first Mass Effect, where I was hating the game because of all the extra content in it, instead of playing the main story first and then going to the secondary content. And this is where I feel we have one of the design flaws of the game, where it should almost reward players that go out of their way to achieve the secondary objectives first. Like in the instance of taking down the demons' hideouts, I feel if you're working to destabilize a major enemy like Martin Lee's Mr. Negative, I feel the enemy encounters should be weaker towards the tail end of the game. The story content should be easier if a player has spent more time actively taking down bases that support that enemy, rather than getting more and more powerful weapons and armor and gadgets. As you take down those bases, it should actually impact where they don't have those resources, and thus the game gets a little easier rather than continually ramping up, where if a player opted not to take down those bases, then yes, the game would be harder, but it doesn't progress in a logical sense. And so if you're like me and you tackle all those things first, it almost feels for naught, because usually at the end of each major story segment, you'll have Peter saying, all right, well, I took down the big bad, but I still have all the minions left over. And it's like, that's not the case, because I took the time to grind through and take down all those bases and stop all the miscellaneous crimes and do everything involving this. And it feels a little unrewarding in that sense. Yes, you get some good secondary story content like Tombstone, Taskmaster, Black Cat. And it fleshes out, a lot of the secondary or ancillary stuff, but it almost does it to a detriment. Like I said, I just would have appreciated a more meaningful impact on the main story by doing the secondary stuff rather than just having it be filler content. Because the game's clearly designed to be a thing where you play through the main story, and now that you've gotten that out of the way, you have all this extra stuff to keep doing, to keep playing the game. And I did it in the opposite order and was almost kind of punished for it. But overall, it works. It handles itself in a way that you're always progressing, you're always moving forward. So even though it doesn't have a larger impact, you're still getting that story content, and it's being handled in a believable way where you have Mary Jane tracking down leads for you, or Yuri Watanabe giving you information on where, kind of like leads. I didn't want to say leads again. But essentially, they're guiding and working with Spider-Man as a team, and having the comedic wit of Spider-Man kind of anchoring everything. It makes the story enjoyable. I mean, from the comedic bits to the more impactful moments towards the end, to the heart-racing scenes of Rhino chasing down Miles Morales. It all works for the most part. There were a couple issues I had, namely where the story seemed to get sidetracked by forced stealth sections, which when you're playing as Spider-Man isn't a big deal. I'm not a big fan of stealth games, but because I'm playing with a character that has such a different kit compared to like Solid Snake, it's new, it's unique, it's interesting. But when the game forces you to play as Miles or as Mary Jane, it almost brings the action to a screeching halt, and you're just left wanting to get back to the part where you're playing as Spider-Man. Again, it still advances the story, it's still enjoyable to an extent, but you're always left wanting just to get back to what it was before. Like, I didn't buy Mary Jane Watson the game or Miles Morales the game. I bought Spider-Man. I wanted to play as Spider-Man. Now, those sections aren't dominating, but they are still ever present, where more than once you'll be forced into that situation. And it's just a matter of kind of getting through it. And that's kind of unfortunate. But the characters themselves are all extremely well developed. Everybody's fleshed out and rounded out and has plenty of details to them. And I don't know, maybe I come in with a bit of an unfair advantage, having read Spider-Man comics the entirety of my life and seeing the movies and playing all the games. Like, I know who he is. I know who his secondary characters are. And even if the game isn't presenting a lot of these finer details, my mind is filling that in the background. But I feel like Spider-Man is such a universal icon, and everybody knows these characters. Even if they don't know their names or all the nuances, they have a good idea of who they are and how they work and fit in together into this larger picture of Spider-Man's universe. And we get quite a large variety. We have a very basic formation of the Sinister Six. We have, like I said, characters like Tombstone and Black Cat, even if she doesn't make a physical appearance in the main game. Even, newer characters like Martin Lee or folks that are relatively unknown. Introducing characters like Miles Morales, who, had his movie debut earlier that year. But seeing another version of him, it all works. And I cared for each of these characters. Even if I didn't necessarily like them, it was for reasons it was meant to be. Like, yeah, they're meant to be annoying or they're meant to be a bad guy. Even people like J. Jonah Jameson with his podcast, I loved his podcast where there's short 2 or 3 minutes blurbs on how, Spider-Man hates New Yorkers and causes gridlock, or hates tooth care. Just anything he can to do to link it back to how terrible Spider-Man is, he does. And it's rather than have, J. Jonah Jameson, the editor of the Daily Bugle, we have it in a more direct, or I guess updated context where everybody and their brother, this show being a prime example, has a fucking podcast. And seeing him presented in a new light, with a different take, but still having the same slant, it warmed the cockles of my heart, and I greatly enjoyed it. And that's kind of just the overall impression of the game itself. There's a lot to do, and it's a joy to do all of it. Now, it can wear long in the tooth, but that's entirely on the player as far as how far they want to push it. If you're going to be the type of person who works to get essentially gold medals in all of the bases or the Taskmaster challenges, yeah, you might have a bit more of a frustrating or annoying time, but you do get that sense of satisfaction. Like, I've done it. I've completed this thing. I've checked the box off. It's very much a task list of a game, and if you're the type of person who enjoys completing lists, it's definitely the one for you. And even if you're not, you can skip all of that stuff and just chug through the main content. As I was looking through the trophies on the PlayStation, seeing what the completion rates were, not a lot of people delve into that secondary content, and not a lot of them really got too far into the game itself. And I feel that's a shame. They're depriving themselves of such a wonderful single-player story campaign. And in a world now where we have a ever-present series of living games or always online games like, Destiny or Fortnite or Warcraft, or essentially a game that's always online and it's always multiplayer and you're always fighting against other people and trying to stay at the top, it's nice to just disconnect and take your time and work through a game the way they used to be. And I hope that we continue to see more single-player games like this, because if it is all just persistent online worlds, when do you get a chance to kind of sit back and, like the middle-aged man with the basketball hoop in his driveway, you just want to go out and shoot a few three-pointers. You're not necessarily looking for a pickup game or looking to challenge anybody. You just want to do it for the love of the game, and that's kind of how Spider-Man plays to me. Is it's a love song. It's Insomniac looking at what is Spider-Man and giving the audience what they want from Spider-Man. And with the Game of the Year edition coming out now, which bundles all the DLC, there's no better time. And I've said it once before, I'll say it again, the PS4 absolutely knocked it out of the park with this generation, with so many strong exclusive titles, especially in this single-player arena, where if that's something that you're after, it's a must-buy, and Spider-Man is one of those titles that makes it that. So if you have the PS4, you don't have an excuse. You need to go buy Spider-Man. That's really kind of all there is to it. So that's going to wrap this one up. Next episode, we'll delve into the DLC, thoughts and feelings there. But beyond that, we'll talk to you next time. If you have your own thoughts, concerns, criticisms, critiques, complaints, or just want to shoot the shit, drop an email over at theunwashedasses@gmail.com. Again, theunwashedasses@gmail.com. And we'll talk to you next time. Blood for the Blood God.